I often like to think to myself, if I had a time machine and I can go back to all those events in history in which I like to study, would I be able to see them in the same light that I see them today? Would I be taking them in with all my modern notions, my preconceived notions that I have just from being alive today? Would you do the same thing? I think that it's a overlooked aspect about studying history, that everyone who sees history, every person who studies it, every person views history in a personal sense, even if it's not personal to them. So if I view the Holocaust, I view a lot of things about it. Someone else could see an entirely different situation based on their own personal experiences. And I think this applies to, obviously, every bit of history, but specifically what I want to talk about on this topic is the American Revolution. I think that in America today, we've been, I don't want to say like indoctrinated or anything, but we've been so accustomed to studying the American Revolution in a patriot sense, in this utmost patriotism combined with studying, because that is the founding of our country. And so it should be. We should love that. We should be super proud of that. But I think it does the person a injustice to not look at both sides of the coin when studying any given argument. So think about it. If you were a judge, do you think it would, or if you were in court and there was a judge who, let's say you're getting sued and you show up to court, but he doesn't let you represent yourself, and the other side gets to only tell his story, and that's that. You'd be pretty upset. It's the same kind of a thing. If you can't learn to analyze history while taking into account the other side of the story, you're not doing yourself any favors while studying it, and you're not learning everything that there could be to learn or getting all the positive aspects out of it. But I think it's important to remember everyone views history based on their own personal reception to it. And I think that a lot of that is overlooked. So let's start with talking about the American Revolution.
It's history like you've never heard it before. You're listening to The Monday American with your host, Andrew Garrett.
The American Revolution was unlike anything the world had ever seen up to that point. It was a movement that saw 13 colonies coming together, yet somehow it took a long time, but it did happen. They evolved into a physical merger into just one nation that, for the very first time in history, was founded to guarantee and protect the rights of the people that comprised the nation. It was a totally new type of revolution, and it gave birth to a new type of world. And one aspect of it that we're going to focus on in this episode is how George Washington and his leadership was the physical embodiment of the American revolutionary spirit. So it was slow to start, this American Revolution, but once it did, it was impossible to stop. This idea of freedom or belief or movement or whatever you want to choose, it was one that took time to grow and root into the minds and spirit of the people and spread. And you got to remember, this is back pre-1776, where, printing on paper was still new. It took time to spread. But once it was there, it spread like wildfire. Well, like any good firefighter would do, or any good investigator would do, you have to find the source of the fire. Now, it's hard to point to just one specific arson of this fire, if you will, but most historians will point to the year of 1763. That is the crucial year in which the American Revolution really began to take shape. It was the year that the French and Indian War came to a close. It left the British Empire reeling in massive debt. That year contained a multitude of ingredients that came together in just the right way to create a path towards freedom from Great Britain. Now, like I said just a second ago, it left the English with massive war debts that were then imposed on the colonists through taxation and the forced quartering of British soldiers that were still occupying the land. And one of the problems was it was a one-sided tax. The residents of England didn't have to contribute in any way that was even close to equal, and to top it off, the colonists didn't enjoy the full rights of the Englishmen, which was parliamentary representation. And one thing that is lost on a lot of us today is the importance of that representation. A lot of people don't understand why it was such a big deal or why it mattered so much to these colonists. Well, again, I say, try to either put yourself in their shoes or extrapolate that to today. Can you imagine what it would be like if you had no say whatsoever over what happened in the governmental workings of your day-to-day life? And what I mean by that is, I guess a good word is infrastructure. So take, for example, let's say that on my way to work, there's a bad road and there's a big pothole. And I'm a farmer and it's ruining my trailers. It's costing me a lot of money, and it's something that's drastically important to me to fix because for one reason or the other, I have no way around it. Now, who fixes that? Who foots the bill to pay for that? In this case, it's the British Crown. But you have no way of being able to put your concerns in front of the Crown because the Crown is 3,000 miles away, and you have no one there to be your voice. And let's be honest, if you're 3,000 miles away, especially in that day, you might as well have been on another planet. You have no voice. They don't care about you. They don't know what your concerns are, and they're not going to do any type of bill or legislation that is going to improve it. And anything that is your benefit, that really honestly is oftentimes just a good coincidence for you. Now, you do have to take it from the other side of the coin and understand that while the British Empire was thriving, there was little in the way of local interference, and there was very little in the way of taxation. Most of what was taxed was hardly even paid to begin with. The colonists were people. They were allowed to be in their own space for so long to forge and create this own unique identity as they saw fit, up until the point where it was suddenly and forcefully taken by a bankrupt imperial force that was a world away from them, from where they were. Now, you do have to see it on both sides. Like I said, during all this time of peace and prosperity, they thrived and they didn't get taxed for it. So, what do you see as the British Crown when you just get done spending 7 years fighting on 5 continents and now you're bankrupt from a war whose main beneficiaries are those people that you don't see hauling their fair share of the cost of that war? Now, that's got to be frustrating, right? So the first thing that you have to ask yourself is, who were these people in this place at that time to begin with? Let's go back to the mid-1700s. Across the American colonies, it was clear that these people were settlers who had become increasingly less English. Travelers would describe them, these Americans, as they were already called, as coarse-looking country folk. Most colonial folk wore their hair very long. Women and girls would keep their hair covered with hats, hoods, and handkerchiefs. Men and boys tied their hats into these queues, which we would call a ponytail today, until wigs came into vogue fashion in the port cities. Remember, the port cities were the biggest ones there during that time. Even the children worked hard because all the Americans worked hard all of their lives. That was the American persona. Most boys and girls, certainly in the frontier areas, would learn how to plow, mend fences, skin animals, dress meat, fish, shoot, hunt, and ride. Their lives, like their parents' lives, were tied to the seasons that they worked. All the while, their survival was, for more or less, completely dependent on what man or what beast would or would not kill them that day. Now, that does sound a little bit towards the flair for dramatic, but that was the reality of their situation. But it would be nothing for a father to go away for days or even weeks at a time, leaving a young teenager in charge of the farm or the livestock, the house, or even in charge of the other family members. At 12 or 13 years old, most boys were looking for work in the form of an apprenticeship. They would learn to craft or trade, either from a cobbler, like a shoemaker, a barrel maker. That was a big one in port cities. A tanner. That'd be more out on the frontier, tanning leather. Fishermen's or some other skilled labor. Now, despite the reality of this coarse lifestyle for common people, it is worth noting that by 1774, American colonists had already attained a standard of living that far surpassed what was found in the most civilized parts of the rest of the world. So all that is to say, they didn't exactly have it all that bad off, and you would feel the same way. They wanted to protect the life that they had. It was a good life. Now, the people that made up the colonies then are the same that you will find here in America today. The American Revolution, it wasn't just a single isolated event. It was a revolution that has shaped the way for us today to be able to live with liberty, freedom, and carry out a pursuit of happiness as each person sees fit. Free Americans in 1776 were a restless, striving, and entrepreneurial people. They routinely assumed risk for the sake of profit. Now, when they went to war, Americans carried this culture with them. Their attitudes towards fighting were different than those of Europe's feudal and aristocratic elites, who thought of war as a nobleman's vocation and a pursuit of honor. Americans tended to think of war as something that had to be done from time to time for a particular purpose or goal. They fought not for the sake of fighting, but for the sake of winning. But they always thought of the fighting as an interruption in their lives, whereas these British troops, they fought they thought of it as their job. They wanted to get it done quickly so that they could get on with the ordinary business of life. Now, these people were already the embodiment of the American ideals that we hold dear today, even when they were the subjects of the British Crown. The people were Americans because of their entrepreneurial spirit that blended with a longing for independence and desire to be subject to no man other than his own mind, body, and spirit, or his own God. And all of that uncomfortable subjugation that they were under was about to come crashing down. And it started with the French and Indian War. Now, those of us in America are usually the only ones that call it by that name. The rest of the world usually knows it as the 7 Years' War. It was a war where both sides, the French versus the British, and it was the French colonists against the the British colonists. Both sides were supported by military units from their parent countries of Great Britain and France, as well as the American Indian allies. You cannot forget them. Now, at the start of the war, the French North American colonies had a population of roughly 60,000 settlers, compared with 2 million to the British. The outnumbered French particularly depended on the Indians, as you would imagine they would have to. The European nations declared war on one another in 1756 following months of localized conflicts, escalating the war from a regional affair into an intercontinental conflict. Like I said, it's known as the 7 Years' War overall. And how it started was over a dispute in land near the Ohio River between the British and French colonialists. That's the most nutshell way to explain its inception. The first instance of conflict was actually the Battle of Jumonville Glen in May of 1754, during which the Virginia militiamen, under the command of a spry 22-year-old George Washington, ambushed a French patrol. The outcome was one of the most significant develops in a century of Anglo-Saxon conflict. Anglo-French conflict. The French ceded to Great Britain its territory east of the Mississippi. This is the wrap-up of the war, is what I'm going through right now, just to give you a nutshell. It ceded French Louisiana west of the Mississippi, including New Orleans, to its ally Spain in compensation for Spain's loss to Britain of Florida. Spain had ceded Florida to Britain in exchange for the return of Havana. France's colonial presence, in turn, north of the Caribbean, was reduced to the islands of Saint Pierre and Miquelon. Again, my pronunciation is terrible. Confirming Great Britain's position as the dominant colonial power in eastern North America. Securing the protection and guaranteeing the colonials were unchallenged is how the British could justify taxing the colonies for these debts. They fought a massive global war, and they ended up taking nearly the whole continent, which resulted in the locals being able to expand and continue this life of prosperity that they were living before. Except now they could do it unchallenged. It is imperative to understand that the later actions and that the later taxes we're about to talk about had plausible reasoning for their enactment. History is never a one-sided affair, and to understand it, you have to know it from all the participants. How would you feel if you were England? You're welcome for all the peace, all the land, future prosperity we just won for you, but you know what? Now we need you to help us pay for it. The reason England met so much resistance from the colonists is their own inability to put themselves in the colonists' shoes. The reasoning was there, but the execution was horrific, and they were completely unable to understand why. And this is one of the points that's always just fascinated the heck out of me, is how in God's name did they not think that what they were doing was going to cause any issues? I mean, you got to think other than King George just being someone who was born king, thinking his duty don't stink. You just don't have rational people making these decisions thinking that nothing will come of it. Either way, they were now the most powerful imperial nation, country, whatever you want to call it, on the entire planet. The major downside of all that power is that it costs money in order to keep your imperial colonies running smoothly. You have enemies who continually want that land also. So it costs a lot of money to maintain that status. And that was a price that they were willing to press onto the colonial Americans in order to, quote unquote, pay their fair share, if you will. And the Americans were having none of it. And this is that part in the story that always makes me laugh, because I just think back to a government similar, like one we're in today, saying, hey, we're going to tax you. And the people just respond, no. I just think I've always found that so oddly funny that the people that they were trying to tax just refused to pay. I've always thought that was just an interesting side note. And it's worth noting that I wouldn't be too fond of it either because of the way that they decided to tax them. Now, there's a lot of ways that a government can choose to tax its people, and usually it is not a blatant revenue earner like it was when the British passed a series of acts against the colonists in late 1765. Probably the reason no one has done taxes like that again is because it sparked the revolution of the United States. No one wants to go through that again. But the acts that they passed were revenue earners, and they weren't even trying to cover up the fact that they were just trying to get money. And I think it's important to note that it's a completely within the realm of reasonable thing to ask that the colonists pay up for some of the war debts that were essentially there to protect them in the first place. But again, their lack of ability to see the the optics of the situation of what they were asking or how they were putting it into effect, I mean, that's all on them. That was just, I mean, that you couldn't have done it in a worse way. So I like to call this period after the war and when the British began to get coercive, the end of the honeymoon period. They passed the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Stamp Act, and the Quartering Act. You should, if you're listening and grew up in America, remember the names of these acts from middle or high school history class, or at least the names should sound familiar, and that is because these were the spark that started the fire of revolt against imperial authority. Now, at first in 1764, the colonists' response to the Sugar Act and Currency Act was fairly understated. The Currency Act met almost no protest until years later when the economic effects had settled in. The Sugar Act, however, was a lot more controversial. It was essentially lowering the import duties on foreign molasses. So, you buy sugar, molasses, you have to pay a tax on it when it comes in. And the reason they did that, it was to try to curtail the smuggling that was going on in the colonies. And this is why I was talking about the tax earlier. There was already a tax on the sugar that was coming in, and they just weren't paying it. I still think that's hilarious. Now, if you're actually listening, you should get some confusion. The Sugar Act lowered the import tax on that tax. So in order to curtail that smuggling and to actually get them to pay the tax, they decided to lower the tax on it. That was not the controversial part. You'd think it'd be met with open arms, and normally that would be. But the reason it was so controversial is how the act was carried out and the way it was enforced on those who violated it. The Sugar Act was an amendment to the previous version of the bill known as the Molasses Act. The concepts were the same. It was a revenue-increasing bill that was intended to raise revenue for Great Britain by an import tax. And again, it's not unreasonable, the purpose, or to think that that bill would cause a lot of issues. It's not an unreasonable bill at the surface level. It was how the act was enforced on those found in violation of it that the colonists had a serious problem with. The Sugar Act made anyone found to be in violation of the act subject to a vice admiralty court. That was just a military court without a jury you're basically at the mercy of the general or whoever you see. So basically the accused person got thrown in front of a redcoat-based court. Court is a loose term in that sense. And they were subject to the whim of the commander who was fiercely loyal to the crown. It wasn't the tax that was met with revolt. It was the way the act stripped them of what they believed to be a right to have a fair representation in court. The Englishmen in London weren't subject to anything like the Vice Admiralty Court, so why were they? That was essentially their whole process. Again, look at it from both sides. The crown needed money, and the colonists hadn't been paying taxes from before, so really the fault is at both ends of the spectrum for this one. It's just the way the crown treated the rights of its colonists that is the common denominator for all these decisions to come. They didn't give them equality. Shortly after the Sugar Act, they decided to go with the Stamp Act, and this one was met with instant, wide-open, full-throttle protest. It was clearly a way to only raise revenue, and again, understandable why, but it was the method that infringed on the rights of the colonist. A governing authority cannot expect to pass a law solely to raise revenue in a way that Parliament did and not expect a backlash from it. Laws are supposed to be beneficial to both parties. You regulate trade, levy tax, the merchant is protected, revenue is made. This was a purely money grab by the crown, and it was obvious. The act, it put a tax on paper, essentially. It was a tax on all newspapers, leases, legal documents, pamphlets, and printings, any other printed material. It required that the holder of that printed material affix an actual stamp on the document to show that they had paid for it. This was the crown taxing paper that was created in America for the consumption of Americans and circulated within the colonies. So let's take, for example, a newspaper. Why the hell should I be paying a tax to England for having a copy of a newspaper if I live in, let's say, Savannah, Georgia, and the paper was made in Georgia, created in Georgia, and circulated in Georgia. It's so unfair to tax the colonists, and it was a pretty lazy bill from Parliament, and it was seen as a pure money grab. It's almost as if they didn't have any idea for a tax. They got together and asked themselves, what does literally everyone use all the time? Oh, that's it. We'll tax paper. And they saw no way that could go wrong or get poor reception. Again, the violators of this law were thrown before a vice admiralty court without a jury or lawyer, and the act increased the powers of those courts. The colonial leaders roundly condemned the Stamp Act as an unprecedented violation of their right to be taxed only by their representatives, and they were right in doing so. So this is where the famous no taxation without representation response was born and gained traction throughout all the colonies. Simultaneously, it created a new bond between the previously unrelated colonies, aside from the British rule. It unified them. It gave them that intangible quality that was able to link each of these separate colonies together for a unifying cause. A 19th century historian, Charles A. Beard, said that, quote, American government did not originate in any abstract theories about liberty and equality, but in the actual experience gained by generation after generation of English colonists in managing their own political affairs. Several colonial leaders convened the Stamp Act Congress shortly thereafter. It was held in New York to petition Parliament and King George III to repeal the tax. In 1766, Parliament bowed to public pressure and repealed the Stamp Act, but also quietly passed the Declaratory Act. And that stipulated that Parliament reserved the right to tax the colonies anytime it chose. So for every one step forward, they're taking two back. And it's this back and forth of the colonists they were flatly rejecting to pay the taxes previously, but Parliament couldn't see the error in their own ways. What this Declaratory Act did was the beginning of the British authorities' official response to the colonials that sparked wild outrage. They invoked the theory of virtual representation, whereby each member of Parliament was alleged to represent the interests of all Britain and the Empire, not just those of his constituents. The colonists were outraged, and understandably so. They demanded actual representation only from those legislators that they voted into office, therefore they could vote them out as well, and held the belief that because they were not allowed to vote on any members of Parliament, that any parliamentary taxation deprived them of their property without their consent. This is where the words of Samuel Adams himself are really the only applicable ones that can describe the sentiments of the colonists at the time. And he said, among the natural rights of the colonists are these: first, a right to life, second to liberty, and thirdly to property, together with the right to defend them in the best manner they can. Now, as you might imagine, this was not a immediate type of revolt that the colonists had. This took quite a bit of time to coalesce and quite a bit of time for word to travel. And the way that they did that was through the new creation of the printing press. In August of 1765, Daniel Delaney wrote a pamphlet called Considerations on the Propriety of Imposing Taxes in the British Colonies. Now, the heart of this pamphlet is really what ended up being the most influential of all the pamphlets circulated about the Stamp Act. And in it, he poses one paragraph, which I'm going to read, about the injustices of the Stamp Act. So I'm going to pick up kind of halfway through. And he starts by saying, by talking about how the Parliament doesn't have the authority to tax them when they are not subject to them. He starts by saying, this observation being considered, it will undeniably appear that in framing the late Stamp Act, the Commons acted in the character of representative of the colonies. They assumed it as the principle of that measure, and the propriety of it must therefore stand or fall as the principle is true or false. For the preamble sets forth that the Commons of Great Britain had resolved to give and grant the several rates and duties imposed by the Act. But what right had the Commons of Great Britain to be thus munificent at the expense of the Commons of America? To give property not belonging to the giver and without the consent of the owner is such evident and flagrant injustice in ordinary cases that few are hardy enough to avow it. And therefore, when it really happens, the fact is disguised and varnished over by the most plausible pretenses the ingenuity of the giver can suggest. And this is what became the central battle cry of the colonists. Basically, the Parliament had set its own guidelines for how these people should act when they knew nothing about their life. They just came in and took everything. And then take into account that, and they had to provide housing for the troops that were still there, and they had no choice in saying yes. And just to show you the lack of optics that Parliament and the English government had, a letter was penned in response by a man named Thomas Hutchinson, and he wrote that to his friend back in England, and he was talking about the Stamp Act and the options that Parliament had, but this was a man who was in charge of basically being the authority of an entire colony. Think of him as a governor. And he wrote to his friend, "On the one hand, it will be said if concessions be made, the Parliament endanger the loss of their authority over the colonies. On the other hand, if external force should be used, there seems to be danger of a total lasting alienation of affection. Is there no alternative?" And that should show you that the way these parliamentary thinkers were thinking was one of two options. They couldn't think openly, or they couldn't get their head outside of the box to solve a problem, so every solution they came up with ended up hurting them more and more in the long run. So these pre-war days were essentially a back and forth between the colonists and Parliament, arguing who had a right to what and who represented what and who gave them that authority. It's no wonder that it ended in bloodshed when it didn't need to, but hindsight is 2020, and certainly you couldn't change history like that. It's the instances like these that always remind me of the phrase when I was playing soccer in high school of goals come in pairs. Because all that protesting that the colonists did, it eventually amounted to organizing networks of extra-legal committees. And all that protesting and the extra-legal bodies, if you want to call them that, they kind of went on that notion of goal for goal. They come in pairs because in September of 1774, the First Continental Congress was formed. From then on, de facto political authority shifted gradually from imperial regime to extra-legal bodies at local, provincial, and continental levels. Now, these new committees and congresses, they articulated the colonial grievances, enforced commercial boycotts, they planned military defense, and they would straight up harass people who were emerging against the new emerging revolutionary order. Now, if you're Parliament and this kind of stuff is going on, you only have one real option to respond with, and you send your military over there. You got to think about it from their perspective, is they have a bunch of people who are their citizens, and for how they see it, they're subjects, and they're rising up. What do? You defend your authority. So they sent over British troops to impose a presence, and this was where the revolutionary movement in America became bloody. And I think it's worth pointing out the difference in this revolution versus other revolutions in history's past. I mean, you look at France and their revolution, which granted was after this one, but heads were rolling. Heads were rolling from guillotines before revolution happened. And I say it's different because this revolution, it grew from peace, essentially. The movement was ahead of the bloodshed, and I think that's a rare thing in history, and I think it's part of what makes this country so unique. It's the ideals that came before the movement really took place. They planted a seed of Americanism, and the war followed. It wasn't a revolution born from conflict. It was a a strong belief that led to a conflict for freedom. I just think that's a very big disparity with how you normally see revolutions happen in the past. Now, if you're a citizen of Boston in 1770 and you hear that British troops are coming over to essentially rein you in, how are you going to feel? Probably not all that great. And the Boston radicals warned that the arrival of the troops would lead to tyranny. So what they did was they encouraged their neighbors to intimidate and ridicule the soldiers and anyone else who upheld British imperial authority. The first violence between townspeople and troops occurred in February of 1770. An angry crowd stormed the premises of a known customs informer, and that man panicked and he fired on the group. And in that volley, he killed an 11-year-old boy named Christopher Snyder. This is where Samuel Adams comes on the scene with his Sons of Liberty. They made the boy's funeral a very big public event at which the soldiers were demonized as predatory minions of tyranny. Now, what I think is interesting is that the bad feeling between these troops and townspeople, it became as much personal as it was political in the coming months leading up to the war, because the soldiers were competing with the men for part-time work in a very depressed economy at the time. Don't forget, Britain was broke, and the colonists were being taxed very heavily, and their exports were not shipping out as well, you could say. Well, these tensions finally came to a head on the evening of March 5th of 1770. A crowd of Bostonians began pelting a sentry from that very same regiment with snowballs as he guarded the customs house on King Street in Boston. The sentry was calling out for help because at this time it was a pretty big crowd. His captain, named Robert Preston, arrived with a small contingent of soldiers. Now, it was at this point that the townspeople began to feel like they were in a war. They felt like they were being surrounded by soldiers. There's a lot of contention about the acts of this evening, but at this point, someone sounded the fire bell, and that brought a lot of townspeople outside to the scene. For about 15 minutes, the crowd managed to taunt the soldiers, waving sticks and even swords, and this Preston managed to keep his men in line until a stick or snowball hit Private Hugh Montgomery, and he fell, and when he regained his footing, he fired his gun. And if you're a soldier, what do you do when your buddy fires a gun? You fire in the same direction. When the smoke cleared, the soldiers had shot 11 men, of whom 5 would die. Now, that instance was given a significantly different account of what happened by the soldier and by the townspeople. Captain Preston stressed the antipathy of the crowd and the confusion of his troops, which I do believe. I mean, if you were surrounded by angry townspeople taunting you and throwing sticks at you, I mean, you probably feared for your life. The Boston radicals portrayed the soldiers as intent on overpowering the innocent, unarmed men that they saw as their inferiors. The authorities referred to the incident as the King Street Riot. Now, the propaganda efforts of Sam Adams and his associates, however, ensured that it would become widely known in America as the Boston Massacre. And the vocabulary is important here. In that day and age, massacre was a term that they used chiefly to describe Indian raids on white towns, and it was a term that denoted brutal and purposeful acts of barbarity against innocent and virtuous people. Paul Revere, who was a Boston silversmith, and you should recognize the name, he portrayed the troops in this silver engraving, because he was also a silversmith. He portrayed them as purposely assaulting the townspeople. Now, his image, along with the words of John Adams and others, they spread the news of the affair and shaped the popular response to it. And that is just so typical for this day and age. News was spread by word of mouth or by paper. And if you're getting taxed by paper, who the heck wants to pay for that? This Boston Massacre, it evoked a fear and outrage, despite the efforts of the Massachusetts governor, to defuse the situation, ensuring that the soldiers who were implicated in the affair were indicted and tried for murder. And I think this is one of the most incredible instances of American freedom, because John Adams took the case as the defense attorney for these soldiers. Now, they were acquitted. All but 2 of them were acquitted, and they were charged with manslaughter, not intentional murder. And I think that's a big deal one of these founding fathers believed so deeply in his own ideals and the ideals that they all shared, he was willing to be there to give his enemies essentially a fair trial and representation in court. That's a right we all enjoy today. I just think that's just such a good personification of the American ideals that were laid out in the Constitution. What else the Boston Massacre did it had created 3 short-term consequences. The violence resulted in a quick removal of troops to an island in the harbor instead of Boston proper. It gave the American cause, the revolutionary cause, 5 martyrs to the name of colonial liberty, and it resulted in an amendment of New England's civic calendar. And what I mean by that is, in Boston, the anniversary of this Boston Massacre, it was observed with sober patriotism. Now, although the Bostonians at that time claimed to be subjects to the crown, by embracing this new tradition and resistance to British rule, they were taking a very important step in the formation of a new political identity. And it's odd to note that of everything that had happened up to this point, the Boston Massacre was the one thing that warranted very little parliamentary action. Everything else was met with a bill, and then a bill to enforce the bill, and then a bill to enforce that bill. The Boston Massacre was hardly met with anything. There were a few years of relative peace until May of 1773. The British Crown was still struggling with money, and they enacted the Tea Act, and I think that we all know where this one is going as well. The Tea Act was mainly to help out the British East India Trading Company, because remember, everyone was broke at this point, and it had unintended consequences, which is kind of the story so far of the American Revolution, unintended consequences. Basically, it allowed for the East India Trading Company to sell directly to the consumer. Well, that's a big problem if you are relying on your family's food intake from being the middleman salesman. And that's how it works today. There's a manufacturer, there's a distributor, there's even a retailer, and then there's a consumer. Oftentimes there's just manufacturer to distributor to consumer, but you get the point. They effectively bankrupted all these merchants that were waiting on this tea, and the people wouldn't take it anymore. And that's when the famous Boston Tea Party all went down. And we all know the story. They got on board a ship and dumped the tea in protest. But that was the boiling point of the American Revolution. That was it. That, combined with the Boston Massacre, and the people had had enough. And it was after that Tea Party that Parliament passed a set of acts that most people point to the last real direct cause of the American Revolution. The one last thing in this string of events that actually was the spark that set the fire. And these were the coercive acts. Now, the coercive acts, they were purely punishment on the people of Massachusetts. Among one of them was if anyone was caught in imperial usurpation, they would need to face trial either in England or in a different colony. And this was directly to get them away from the justice of their own jury, which is just that's against our Constitution today. And just to top it off, they decided to close the port of Boston, which further choked out an already stagnant economy. And the reason that these coercive acts differ again is because they were direct punishment on the people of Boston and the people of Massachusetts. But the reason they were the start of the war is because for the first time in the history of the colonies, the cause of Massachusetts was the cause of America. The coercive acts led directly and swiftly to the convening of the first, another Continental Congress, but this one a lot of people consider the first real one because it ended with the declaration of grievances against the king and against the crown, and a document that spelled out the rights of the people or the rights of the colonists in America. Now, on top of that declaration of grievances and rights, the colonists drafted one more thing, and that was the their intent of non-importation and non-exportation. Basically what that means is they were done trading with Britain. They were trying to play their strong arm. This was the New World. This was the place that had all the raw materials, all the cotton, all the indigo that they used for their dyes. And England made a lot of money off of that and off of them purchasing their goods as well. The threat to end their trade with the crown is what brought about the first Battle of Concord and the first real conflict of the American Revolution. And this is that famous one if by land, two if by sea story, because the colonists sent out Paul Revere and William Dawes to the towns of Lexington and Concord. I believe it's Concord. Don't let my southern upbringing change it to Concord. I'm sorry. And their goal was to alert the inhabitants of the approaching regulars, and they were there in order to destroy this cache of weapons and gunpowder in response to the Tea Party, because the Crown and General Gage, they decided that the only way to quell this insurrection was a display of force, so they were on their way. General Gage left Boston with about 700 men, and the next day, both the British regulars and the colonial militia, they were pretty much ready for action. Now, on their way to their objective was the town of Lexington, and that is where the British Army started marching through. And 70 Minutemen were assembling on the village green at dawn on April 19th, silently protesting the soldiers' march through their community. Then Major John Pitcairn ordered that the Minutemen disperse. They began to do so until somebody fired a shot. And that is commonly referred to as the shot that was heard around the world. And I believe there's still rampant debate even today as far as who shot first and does it even really matter? And of course it matters, but that's history. That's historians for you, really. Regardless, there was a shot fired. And when the British made it to Concord, my southern again, after they got through Lexington, there were a couple deaths, not many, but once the dust settled, they were on their way to Concord. Dang it. It's going to be Concord from now on. You're just going to have to deal with it. So they were on their way to Concord. And Lexington happened. And when they got there, when they got to Concord, the militia was ready for them. And there was a real battle. And it's known as the First Battle of Concord. But in typical rebel-rousing American fashion, after the British regulars were done in Concord, they had to go back through Lexington to return to Boston. And by the time they got back to Lexington, more militiamen had heard, the news had spread, and they were waiting for them when they got back. So there were two battles at Lexington. They fought them all the way back to Boston, and the British troops, in a tactical retreat, made it all the way back to Boston under heavy fire, and the surrounding, the hodgepodge militias that made up that hodgepodge little army, they surrounded Boston in what is known as the Siege of Boston. And this was the first official military engagement of the entire of our country, of the American Revolution, the battles at Lexington and Concord. Now it's safe to say that these American militiamen, and they didn't even have a real army at that point, they were just starting it up under George Washington. No one had any idea what they were in for. And I don't think anything really embodies the American Revolution more than George Washington himself and the way that he established these American ideals. So in 1776, Americans were less interested in pulling down a monarchy than they were in raising up a new republic. And Washington's leadership was becoming a major part of that process within the army. He had men who were coming from different parts of the continent. He had them beginning to understand each other, and he was learning how to lead them. He learned that the discipline of a European regular army, it became the enemy of order in an open society. To impose the heavy flogging and capital punishments that were nothing short of routine in European armies would crush an American army. And that is that idyllic independence. It was in the Army too. The men just would not stand for that kind of abuse. He famously had a militia of backcountry riflemen. They got convicted for mutiny, and back then, if you mutinied in the Army, you were dead. Yeah, you better not get caught, or you better kill yourself, because they were going to kill you. Washington instead did not pose the death penalty that was customary in British service, and what he did was, it was kind of the first act of Americanism to me. He fined the guilty riflemen 20 shillings each and appealed to their honor, reason, and pride and conscience. In turn, they declared themselves heartily sorry, that's their quote, heartily sorry, and promised to reform at least a little. So slowly, this army of free men was learning how to work together. They were also coming to respect this extraordinary man who was their leader, if not quite their commander-in-chief yet. They'd come a long way towards forming an army, but was it enough? George Washington knew that they were about to meet some of the most formidable troops in the world, and the outcome was very much in doubt. And it was on the morning of June 29th of 1776, a quiet summer Saturday in New York, where Private Daniel McCurtain of the Maryland line, I am sorry, I do not speak English right now, of the Maryland line, he was there when the British regulars arrived in New York on that morning, and he was probably one of the first people to get a glimpse of what they were really up against. He opened the window when he got out of bed, looked out and admired the view across the empty sheet of water, and a few minutes later he looked back, and to his utter amazement, the bay was full of ships. And his quote is, "I could not believe my eyes. Keeping my eyes fixed at the very spot, judge you of my surprise when in about 10 minutes, the whole bay was full of shipping as ever it could be. I declare that I thought all London was afloat." The British were coming to war, and they were coming to get their territory back. And would the American, this conglomerate of untrained civilians, be able to beat in a land war one of the most experienced and well-trained armies that the world had ever seen? Because if you were there that day and you were with Private McMartin, I can't remember, honestly, and if you were looking at what he was looking at, I don't think you would think that the Americans stood a chance. The British were landing on Staten Island, and in the next 6 weeks they had, let me get this right for you, they had more than 500 transport ships in the New York Lower Harbor. They brought 23,000 British regulars plus 10,000 German troops, many civilian workers, and several thousand women of the army. Another 13,000 troops were sent to Canada. By late August, 2/3 of the British army were in the colonies. And in order to back all these troops up, in late 1776, half of the fighting strength of the Royal Navy was present. At this point in time, it was the largest projection of a seaborne power ever attempted by a European state. But what was even more intimidating was the professionalism of this army. Because what's an army if they aren't well trained? Even if they're plenty in numbers, they're going to be low in skill. This was a modern professional army with so much experience of war. Its 15 generals were on average of 48 years old in 1776, with each one of them already having 30 years experience of military service. By comparison, the 21 American generals who opposed them in New York were 43 years old with 2 years of military service. Even the privates in the army of the British had an average of 9 years service. Most American troops had only a few months of active duty. So you take the general's experience of 30 years to the Americans' generals of 2 years, even the privates and the British regulars had 9. Compared to a few months and 2 years, this was shaping up to be one of those things that you look at on paper and you would never even bet on. Surely you wouldn't bet your own life on it, but these people did. Just take into consideration the fact that in the last 10 years before this conflict in Staten Island, the British regulars and their generals had fought on 5 different continents, and they had defeated every power that they came across. This was no ordinary army, and this was the last army in the world that you would pick to fight against if you had a choice. One American who knew that British army very well, I guess he came from it and switched sides, but a famous quote about that army was he was watching him in Staten Island and said, quote, "This is the most arrogant army in the world." It had a lot to be arrogant about. Not only was this a big army, but it was a smart one. Every one of the British officers, if they made it alive to be an officer, because before the American Revolutionary War, if you were a British regular soldier, you had enlisted for your life. This was a professional army, but they sent every officer to what they called them gentlemen cadets. They sent them to the Woolwich Military Academy. The soldiers simply called it the shop. This is where they studied algebra, trigonometry, quadratic equations, chemistry, engineering, and logistics, and they became an intellectual elite in the army. So not only were they large in numbers, but they were insanely intelligent. And by comparison, they were facing off against a bunch of voluntary, short-term militia Minutemen who were farmers first, soldiers second. It makes you wonder what kind of drugs these American Minutemen had at their disposal to look at an army like that and to look at an army like themselves and know you were going to die. They knew they were going to die, and they still went out there and they fought for what they believed in. Now, if that was enough, not only were they the largest, smartest, and most professional, well-trained, undefeated army in the world at the time, they were worried about their numbers, so they brought along with them a lot of Germans. Now, these Hessians, as they were called at that time, because Germany was not an official country until, I think, 1861, that's still a way off, they made more use of capital punishment than any other army. They were hung for leaving their post. They knew that their families at home would be punished for their misconduct. Field discipline was relentless, more so than in the British or American armies for sure. A case in point was an incident that involved 3 armies in America. On October 27th of 1776, a Hessian soldier straggled from camp and was captured by the Americans. He was brought to General Washington, who told him that, quote, Hessians would get great encouragement if they changed sides. The American commander-in-chief gave him a guinea, and he dismissed him back to go to his corps. The Hessian made his way back to British lines, was taken to General Howe. The German soldier explained what had happened, and Howe likewise gave him a guinea for coming back. Then he returned to his own commanders and explained once more what had happened. The Hessian general listened and then, quote, ordered him to be flogged for straggling far from camp in the first place. It makes you wonder who kept all that money. By savage discipline and endless drill, the Hessian army developed the dark arts of training men to a condition of instinctive and unquestioning obedience. And it worked. At the Battle of White Plains, in the Nijmegen, this is a hard one to pronounce, guys, Nijmegen regiment, this regiment of men was ordered to advance against heavy musketry through a field of tall grass. The grass had caught fire, but the Hessian infantry kept advancing through the burning field. Not only that, they were carrying their cartridge boxes over their heads so that the ammunition would not explode. They were stopped by heavy American volleys and driven back, but they came forward again and carried the day with heavy losses. They were legendary for their discipline, courage, and obedience, as long as their officers and sergeants were there to lead them, sometimes by inspiring great fear. I mean, these men were literally advancing through tall grass, burning themselves alive because they were ordered to do so and keep their ammo from exploding. And that's what we were up against. No one would have assumed the outcome of what would have happened. And it makes you wonder what kind of bravery that these men had in order to look at their opponent and look at their opponent's buddy who they brought, who was marching through fire, and think that you had a snowball's chance in hell. Without the help of one person, which is always the story in history, there's always one person. It's always one person that contributes to one thing or the other. But without the leadership of George Washington, without him specifically being there to lead this army, the American army may as well have just set itself on fire and saved everyone else the time. Because as it looked right now, at this point in the story, there was no chance whatsoever. As always, you can, if you liked the show, of course, visit the website, themondayamerican.com, Twitter, Facebook, Stitcher, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Apple Podcast, which is what you have to call it now because of their branding laws. We're all over. We really appreciate the support you've given us so far. Small announcement. We just got approved for iHeartRadio, and as far as I know, that's a pretty difficult process. So I wasn't expecting to get that done for quite some time. So thank you for sharing and thank you for your support. Be on the lookout for a collaboration with the Mulder Was Right podcast coming out relatively soon. I know I'm excited, and you guys should be too, but you don't have to follow my advice because, like I just said, it's a free country. Just spend about an hour telling you that. Give us an email at contact@themondayamerican. Go to themondayamerican.com. You can get all your life necessities there. I hope you enjoyed part 1. Please leave a review wherever you can. And I am looking forward to bringing you part 2 when we meet next time.